At Meridian Industries' quarterly leadership meeting, my husband Derek pointed at me across the conference room and announced to 70 executives, "My wife Natalie just does basic data entry and accounting, nothing that actually impacts the bottom line." The room erupted in condescending chuckles. But when my boss, Elena Vasquez, stood up and said, "Derek, meet the forensic accountant who just uncovered the embezzlement scheme that would have bankrupted this company," his face went white as paper. Let me tell you how we got here.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The morning started like any other Tuesday at Meridian Industries, the pharmaceutical giant where both Derek and I had built our careers over the past 8 years. Derek burst through the accounting department's glass doors, his Armani suit perfectly pressed, and his confidence radiating the kind of energy that came from closing another major deal in the sales division. "Nat, you need to come to the executive presentation," he said, barely glancing at the complex spreadsheets covering my dual monitors. "Thompson wants all department heads to bring their teams for the quarterly review." I looked up from the financial anomalies I'd been tracking for weeks, irregularities that suggested systematic fraud. "I'm in the middle of something critical, Derek. Can't you represent our household at this one?" His laugh carried that familiar edge of condescension. "Come on, it'll be good for you to see how real business gets done. You spend so much time buried in those numbers, you forget there's an actual company running around all that paperwork." What Derek didn't know was that those boring numbers had just revealed something that would shake Meridian Industries to its foundation. 3 weeks earlier, I'd noticed discrepancies in our vendor payment system, small amounts that followed patterns suggesting intentional manipulation rather than clerical mistakes. My forensic accounting background had trained me to recognize these patterns. The slight variations in vendor names, payments processed just under approval thresholds, timing that avoided normal audit cycles, all pointed to someone with inside knowledge systematically siphoning money from the company. The deeper I dug, the more extensive the scheme became. Shell companies with addresses leading to vacant lots, vendor contracts existing only on paper, purchase orders for services never rendered and products never delivered. Someone had been stealing from Meridian Industries for at least 3 years, and the total amount was staggering. Elena Vasquez, my boss and the chief financial officer, rarely made specific requests for individual attendance at executive meetings. If Elena wanted me there, she had a reason. I saved my work and locked my computer, the financial evidence of systematic fraud safely encrypted in files that would soon reshape everything at Meridian Industries. As I gathered my notepad and followed Derek toward the executive conference room, I had no idea that I was walking into the most humiliating professional moment of my life. The executive conference room occupied the northwest corner of Meridian's 32nd floor with panoramic city views. Derek immediately gravitated toward his sales colleagues, while I found a seat toward the back among the predominantly male gathering of Meridian's leadership. Elena commanded attention the moment she entered. Her reputation for financial acumen was legendary. She'd restructured 3 companies through major financial crises before joining Meridian 5 years earlier, with the paranoid precision of someone who'd seen too many companies destroyed by internal fraud. As Thompson Mitchell began presenting quarterly performance metrics, I found myself thinking about the sophisticated embezzlement scheme consuming my days and nights. The timing of payments, manipulation of approval processes, careful coordination with vendor management, it all pointed to insider involvement at a very high level. Looking around at Meridian's leadership, I wondered if the person stealing millions from the company was sitting among us, listening to quarterly reports while secretly planning their next fraudulent transaction. The thought sharpened my resolve to complete the investigation that would expose the truth. "What exactly does Natalie do here at Meridian?" asked James Hartwell, our head of operations, during the coffee break. The question was directed at Derek, not me, despite my standing right there perfectly capable of answering. Before I could open my mouth, Derek jumped in with that laugh I'd come to dread. "Oh, Natalie keeps busy with the books. She handles invoices, processes payments, makes sure the numbers add up correctly. You know, the administrative side that keeps the wheels turning while the rest of us focus on strategy and growth. The words hit like a physical blow. Administrative side. As if my decade of experience in forensic accounting, my advanced certification in fraud examination, and my master's degree in financial analysis were elaborate qualifications for data entry? As if the complex investigations I conducted were simply making sure numbers add up. 6 months earlier, my forensic analysis had identified a vendor billing scheme costing Meridian nearly $2 million annually. The report I'd written, detailing the fraud, had been distributed to the board of directors and resulted in 3 terminations and complete vendor management overhaul. But according to my husband, I just processed invoices. James nodded politely with that acknowledgement without interest tone. That's important work. Someone has to keep track of details, while the big picture people handle strategic decisions. The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. In James's mind, and apparently Derek's, there were 2 work categories: strategic decision-making that drove the company forward, and administrative support that handled routine maintenance. My forensic accounting had been relegated to the second category, despite saving the company millions and protecting it from regulatory violations. The finance team does crucial work, said Patricia Chen, joining our conversation, especially with pharmaceutical regulatory compliance requirements. The financial auditing alone is incredibly complex. I felt grateful toward Patricia for recognizing the sophistication of my department's work. Pharmaceutical companies face layers of financial oversight from federal agencies, insurance providers, and international regulatory bodies, requiring tracking of research costs, clinical trial expenditures, regulatory compliance expenses, and patent licensing fees across multiple jurisdictions. It's definitely gotten more complicated, I said, hoping to steer toward my actual work scope. We're dealing with sophisticated compliance requirements, and the forensic analysis component has become much more demanding. See, that's what I mean, Derek interrupted, placing his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that might have looked supportive but felt patronizing. Natalie gets so deep into technical details that she sometimes loses sight of the bigger strategic picture. It's great that she's thorough, but at the executive level, we need to focus on growth initiatives and market positioning rather than getting bogged down in compliance minutia. Compliance minutia made my stomach clench. Derek was reducing forensic fraud investigation, work protecting Meridian from catastrophic losses, to bureaucratic busy work. He was suggesting my expertise in uncovering financial crimes was less valuable than his sales contract negotiations. What made the dismissal painful was the context Derek was missing. While he celebrated sales victories, I'd been working 16-hour days uncovering the embezzlement scheme systematically draining money from the company he claimed to care about. The compliance minutia included evidence of fraud that could eventually bankrupt Meridian if unchecked. As conversation shifted to European market expansion, I stood silently, invisible, despite being physically present. The executives discussed strategies I could contribute to meaningfully. My forensic work had given me deep insight into international fraud schemes valuable for global expansion. But I'd been characterized as handling administrative details, removing me from professional discourse among peers. The most frustrating part was watching Derek bask in recognition for sales achievements while his success was being undermined by the very fraud I was investigating. The administrative work he dismissed was actually complex financial investigation that would save Meridian tens of millions of dollars. Standing in that break room, listening to executives discuss strategies that could benefit from my expertise, while being characterized as someone who processed paperwork, I realized how completely Derek's perception of my work had changed. The woman who'd helped build his confidence had become, in his mind, an administrative assistant who happened to work in the same building. What Derek didn't know was that my administrative work had uncovered a financial conspiracy threatening the very foundation of Meridian Industries. While he was dismissing my expertise as paperwork processing, I was documenting the largest embezzlement scheme in the company's 40-year history.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The investigation had started 3 months ago with something seemingly insignificant, a vendor payment for office supplies that didn't match inventory records. Clearwater Office Solutions had been paid $4,800 for ergonomic chairs never delivered to any facilities. It should have been simple vendor dispute, easily resolved with a phone call. But when I called Clearwater's listed number, I reached a disconnected voicemail. Their address led to a vacant strip mall 40 miles outside the city. Business registration showed a company incorporated 6 weeks before their first Meridian payment, with corporate officers whose names appeared nowhere in public records. My forensic training taught me to recognize these patterns: shell companies with minimal operational history, business addresses corresponding to no actual facilities, corporate structures designed to obscure ownership and accountability. What looked like billing error was actually systematic fraud evidence. I'd spent 12 weeks reconstructing 3 years of vendor payments, cross-referencing with delivery records, inventory data, and service confirmations. What emerged was a sophisticated network of 47 fictitious companies processing fraudulent invoices totaling just over $47 million. The scheme's brilliance lay in its subtlety. No single payment triggered automatic approval reviews. Amounts were calculated to fall below thresholds requiring additional authorization signatures. Timing was coordinated to avoid peak audit periods. Someone with intimate knowledge of Meridian's internal controls had designed virtually invisible fraud. But forensic accountants are trained to see the invisible. We look for patterns revealing intentional manipulation rather than random arrows. We trace financial flows through corporate structures until finding actual destinations. We reconstruct timelines showing coordination rather than coincidence. My analysis revealed not just fraud existence, but operational mechanics. Shell companies were registered to variations of the same business address. Bank accounts receiving payments opened within days of each other using similar documentation. Invoicing patterns followed predictable cycles, suggesting automated generation rather than legitimate business activities. Most damaging, approval signatures on fraudulent payments had been processed through legitimate channels. Someone inside Meridian wasn't just aware of these transactions, they were actively facilitating them. The fraud required insider knowledge of vendor management systems, approval workflows, and audit schedules. I'd narrowed potential suspects to fewer than 12 employees with necessary system access and operational knowledge. All were in senior positions. All had been with the company at least 5 years. All were sitting in the conference room where Derek had just dismissed my work as administrative busywork. The financial impact extended beyond stolen money. Meridian's upcoming merger with a European pharmaceutical company required comprehensive financial auditing. If fraud was discovered during that audit, it would terminate the merger and trigger regulatory investigations that could destroy the company's reputation and stock value. More immediately, our quarterly earnings report was scheduled for release in 10 days. Financial statements that would be distributed to shareholders and regulatory agencies were currently overstating Meridian's cash position by $47 million. Publishing those statements without correcting for embezzled funds would constitute securities fraud, exposing the company and its executives to criminal liability. While I'd been working 16-hour days to expose this threat, Derek had been treating my expertise like an amusing hobby. The woman he'd described as someone who keeps busy with the books was actually the person who'd identified a financial conspiracy that could have bankrupted Meridian Industries. The irony was profound. Derek's sales achievements were generating revenue that was being systematically stolen by the very fraud I was investigating. His million-dollar contracts were profitable on paper, but actual cash was disappearing through the shell company network I'd exposed. 8 years ago, Derek Morrison and I were ambitious graduate students who met in Northwestern University's library finance section at 2 in the morning during finals week. I was buried in forensic accounting case studies, preparing for my comprehensive exam on white-collar crime detection, when I heard creative profanities from the table next to mine. Derek was wrestling with complex merger analysis for his corporate finance course, his frustration becoming increasingly vocal. "You know," I whispered, glancing at his work, You're calculating debt-to-equity ratios using pre-merger figures, but you need to project the combined entity's leverage ratios post-acquisition. That's why your numbers don't make sense. He looked up with exhausted eyes and grateful smile. You understand corporate finance? I understand financial analysis, I corrected. My specialty is forensic accounting, detecting when companies manipulate financial statements to hide fraud or misrepresent performance. Derek's demeanor changed completely. Instead of the frustrated student, I was suddenly talking to someone genuinely intrigued by expertise he didn't possess. That sounds like detective work. It basically is. We reconstruct financial crimes by analyzing patterns in data that reveal intentional manipulation rather than random errors. It's like being a detective, but instead of looking for fingerprints, we look for anomalies in transaction patterns. That conversation lasted until the library closed at 4 in the morning. Derek was pursuing his MBA with plans to specialize in pharmaceutical sales, while I was completing my master's in forensic accounting for corporate fraud investigation. He wanted to help pharmaceutical companies expand market reach. I wanted to protect companies from internal financial crimes. We should be study partners, Derek suggested. You can help me understand forensic financial analysis, and I can help you understand how legitimate business operations work from the sales perspective. It made perfect sense academically and personally. Derek's understanding of market dynamics and client relationships provided insights into how revenue generation actually worked. My expertise in financial investigation and data analysis provided tools for understanding underlying health and risks of business operations. We spent remaining weeks meeting regularly, working through case studies combining our different perspectives. Derek would explain how pharmaceutical sales teams built relationships with hospital procurement departments and navigated complex bidding processes. I would show him how forensic accountants detected bid rigging schemes and kickback arrangements corrupting those same processes. You're going to revolutionize corporate fraud detection, Derek told me before my final presentation on pharmaceutical industry fraud schemes. Companies are going to fight to hire someone who can protect them from the losses you've documented. And you're going to transform pharmaceutical relationship building with clients, I responded. Your understanding of personal dynamics and B2B sales will set you apart from competitors focused only on product features and pricing. We were both right. Derek's natural charisma and strategic thinking made him exceptionally effective at building long-term client relationships. My analytical skills made me highly sought after by companies needing sophisticated fraud detection capabilities. After graduation, Meridian Industries presented opportunities perfect for both our career goals. They needed someone in sales who could manage complex pharmaceutical distribution relationships and someone in finance who could strengthen fraud prevention capabilities. We could build careers at the same company, Derek suggested. We'd understand each other's work environment, support each other through new position challenges, and have stability of working for the same organization. The decision to join Meridian together felt like natural extension of our Northwestern partnership. We were two professionals with complementary skills building careers that would benefit from mutual support and understanding. During our first year at Meridian, that partnership flourished exactly as hoped. Derek's sales training connected him with hospital administrators, procurement managers, and pharmaceutical distributors across the Midwest. My finance department orientation introduced me to Meridian's complex accounting systems, regulatory compliance requirements, and vendor management processes. We'd spend evenings sharing insights from our respective departments. Derek would tell me about procurement challenges his clients faced, while I'd explain internal controls pharmaceutical companies use to prevent vendor relationship fraud. Our different perspectives enriched our understanding of how Meridian operated as a complete business system. The partnership that had started with late-night library sessions had evolved into marriage between two professionals who understood and valued each other's expertise. We were building parallel careers at the same company with mutual respect and shared goals for future success. Those first 3 years at Meridian Industries represented the best of what Derek and I could accomplish as professional partners. We were both building our careers from entry-level positions, but we were doing it with the kind of mutual support and genuine collaboration that made every challenge feel manageable. Derek's early success in pharmaceutical sales came partly from his natural relationship building skills, but also from the analytical foundation we'd built together during graduate school. When he was preparing for presentations to major hospital chains, I'd help him research their procurement histories, identify potential concerns about vendor relationships, and understand the financial pressures that influence their purchasing decisions.
Riverside Medical Center has been dealing with some vendor billing irregularities, I told him one evening as he prepared for a crucial presentation. Their procurement director was quoted in a medical administration journal talking about the need for pharmaceutical partners who have transparent billing practices and strong internal controls. You should emphasize Meridian's fraud prevention protocols and our commitment to ethical vendor relationships. Derek incorporated that insight into his presentation, and it became a differentiating factor that helped him secure a 3-year contract worth over $8 million. But more importantly, he recognized that my forensic accounting expertise had contributed directly to his sales success. "That research you did on Riverside's concerns was brilliant," he said after closing the contract. "You helped me understand what they really needed to hear, not just what I wanted to tell them about our products. That's the kind of strategic thinking that's going to make both our careers." Meanwhile, Derek's client relationships were providing me with valuable insights into the real-world applications of fraud prevention. Through his interactions with hospital procurement departments and pharmaceutical distributors, he learned about the practical challenges companies faced in detecting and preventing vendor fraud. "The procurement manager at Chicago General mentioned they're struggling with shell company schemes," Derek reported after a client meeting. "Vendors are creating multiple business entities to circumvent their competitive bidding requirements. They're looking for pharmaceutical partners who can help them identify these manipulation tactics." That conversation led me to develop a vendor verification protocol that became standard practice across Meridian's purchasing departments. The system I designed could detect shell company networks by analyzing registration patterns, ownership structures, and operational timelines. It was sophisticated work that required deep expertise in forensic investigation, but it had immediate practical applications that protected the company from costly fraud schemes. Elena Vasquez recognized the value of what I was developing. During my performance reviews, she consistently praised my ability to translate complex fraud detection theories into practical business applications. "Natalie's work is setting new standards for fraud prevention and pharmaceutical procurement," Elena wrote in one evaluation. "Her analytical skills are identifying vulnerabilities that could cost the company millions, and her solutions are sophisticated enough to stay ahead of evolving fraud tactics. She's becoming one of our most valuable assets in financial risk management." Derek was equally supportive of my professional development. When I was selected to attend a national conference on healthcare fraud investigation, he encouraged me to submit a presentation proposal about the vendor verification protocols I'd developed. "You should share this work with the broader forensic accounting community," he insisted. "What you've built here at Meridian could help prevent fraud across the entire pharmaceutical industry. This is the kind of expertise that establishes you as a thought leader in your field." My presentation at that conference was well received, leading to publication opportunities in professional journals and invitations to speak at other industry events. Derek was genuinely proud of the recognition I was receiving, and he understood that my growing reputation in forensic accounting enhanced both our career prospects. "Having a wife who's nationally recognized for fraud prevention expertise is actually helping my sales relationships," he mentioned after one client meeting. "When procurement managers know that my spouse specializes in detecting vendor fraud, it reinforces their confidence in Meridian's commitment to ethical business practices." During those early years, we operated as genuine partners who understood that our individual successes contributed to our shared goals. Derek's sales achievements provided financial stability that allowed me to focus on developing specialized expertise without worrying about immediate income pressure. My forensic accounting work provided analytical insights that enhanced Derek's client presentations and relationship-building strategies. We celebrated each other's victories authentically. When Derek was recognized as Meridian's top sales performer in his second year, I organized a dinner celebration that included colleagues from both our departments.
When I received a Professional Achievement Award from the National Association of Forensic Accountants, Derek arranged for flowers to be delivered to my office with a note that read, "Proud to be married to the best fraud detective in Chicago." Our evening conversations during those years reflected the depth of our professional partnership. Derek would share detailed insights about client relationships, market dynamics, and competitive challenges. I would explain the latest developments in fraud detection techniques, regulatory compliance requirements, and financial investigation methodologies. The hospital chains are getting more sophisticated about vendor evaluation, Derek observed during one of these discussions. They're not just looking at product quality and pricing anymore. They want pharmaceutical partners who can demonstrate comprehensive risk management capabilities. That's because healthcare fraud is becoming more complex, I responded. The schemes we're seeing now involve multiple companies working together to manipulate procurement processes. Hospitals need vendor partners who understand these evolving threats and have systems in place to detect them. These conversations strengthened both our professional knowledge and our personal relationship. We were learning from each other's expertise, building understanding that made us more effective in our respective roles, while deepening our connection as intellectual and romantic partners. Derek's respect for my analytical abilities was genuine and consistent during those years. When he encountered complex financial information in client proposals or competitive analyses, he'd bring the materials home for my review and interpretation. "I can understand the basic numbers," he'd say, "but you can see patterns and implications that I'm missing. Your forensic training gives you insights into financial data that help me ask better questions and make stronger presentations." My appreciation for Derek's relationship-building skills was equally authentic. His ability to understand client needs, build trust with procurement managers, and navigate complex organizational dynamics was teaching me about the human elements of business operations that my analytical training hadn't addressed. "You have an intuition about people and organizational behavior that I'm still learning," I told him. "The way you read client reactions and adjust your approach in real time is helping me understand how to present forensic findings in ways that motivate action rather than just providing information." By our third year at Meridian, we had established ourselves as rising stars in our respective departments while maintaining the collaborative partnership that had brought us together. Derek was being considered for senior sales positions that would involve managing client relationships across multiple states. I was being invited to participate in corporate-level fraud prevention planning that would influence policy across the entire company. "We're building exactly the kind of careers we dreamed about in graduate school," Derek said one evening as we reviewed our performance evaluations and career development plans. "Individual success that supports our shared goals, professional recognition that enhances both our reputations, and the financial stability to make choices based on what we want to achieve rather than what we need to survive." He was right. We had created the partnership we'd envisioned, two professionals with complementary expertise, supporting each other's career development while building individual reputations in our specialized fields. The foundation felt solid, the future felt bright, and our mutual respect felt unshakable. I had no idea that everything was about to change in ways that would test whether our partnership was as strong as we believed it to be. The shift began subtly in our fourth year at Meridian, when my forensic accounting work started gaining recognition that extended beyond the company's internal operations. What had started as routine fraud prevention protocols was evolving into sophisticated investigative techniques that were attracting attention from regulatory agencies and industry associations. The breakthrough came during my investigation of what appeared to be a minor billing discrepancy with a medical equipment vendor. TechnoMed Solutions had been overpaying us by small amounts on their monthly invoices, typically between $50 and $200 per transaction. Most accounting departments would have simply processed refunds and moved on, but my forensic training had taught me that financial anomalies often revealed larger patterns. I spent 3 weeks analyzing TechnoMed's payment history, cross-referencing their transactions with other vendors in our system, and researching their business relationships with other pharmaceutical companies. What I discovered was a sophisticated money laundering scheme that used overpayments to pharmaceutical companies as a method for moving illegally obtained funds through legitimate business accounts. Technomed Solutions was one of 15 companies participating in a network that generated fraudulent revenue through Medicare billing fraud, then used vendor overpayments to move that money into clean accounts that could be accessed without triggering regulatory scrutiny. The overpayments we'd been receiving weren't errors, they were criminal proceeds being laundered through our accounts receivable system. My investigation revealed that the scheme had processed over $12 million through vendor overpayment networks across the pharmaceutical industry. When I contacted the FBI's healthcare fraud unit with my findings, they confirmed that my analysis had uncovered a multi-state criminal enterprise that had been operating undetected for over 2 years. Ms. Morrison, your forensic work has identified one of the most sophisticated Medicare fraud and money laundering schemes we've encountered, Special Agent Rachel Torres told me during the federal investigation. The analytical techniques you used to trace these financial flows are exactly the kind of expertise we need to combat healthcare fraud at this level of complexity. Agent Torres offered me a position with the FBI's white-collar crime unit, specializing in healthcare fraud investigation. The salary would have been nearly double what I was earning at Meridian, with opportunities to work on cases that could impact healthcare fraud prevention nationwide. I declined the offer because Derek and I had built our careers around the partnership we'd established at Meridian, and I wasn't ready to disrupt that foundation. But the recognition from federal law enforcement confirmed that my expertise had developed beyond routine corporate fraud prevention into sophisticated criminal investigation capabilities. The Technomed case also established my reputation within the forensic accounting community. The techniques I developed for tracing money laundering through vendor payment systems became standard protocols that were adopted by pharmaceutical companies across the industry. I was invited to present my findings at the National Healthcare Fraud Prevention Conference, where my presentation was attended by over 800 fraud investigators from private companies, government agencies, and law enforcement organizations. Natalie Morrison's work represents the evolution of forensic accounting from reactive fraud detection to proactive criminal investigation, wrote Dr. Michael Chen, editor of the Journal of Healthcare Fraud Investigation, in his review of my conference presentation. Her analytical techniques are identifying criminal enterprises that traditional auditing methods would never detect. The professional recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it validated the career direction I'd been pursuing since graduate school. My expertise in forensic accounting wasn't just preventing routine fraud, it was uncovering criminal conspiracies that threatened the integrity of healthcare finance systems. Derek was proud of the recognition I was receiving, but I began to notice subtle changes in how he discussed my work with others. Instead of describing my role as forensic accounting or fraud investigation, he started using more generic terms like financial analysis or accounting work. When colleagues asked about the FBI case or the conference presentations, Derek would acknowledge them briefly before redirecting conversations toward his own sales achievements. Natalie's been doing some interesting compliance work, he'd say when people inquired about the federal investigation. She's very thorough with the regulatory requirements and documentation. Meanwhile, I've been focused on expanding our market share in the Midwest hospital systems. The characterization bothered me because it minimized the complexity and significance of what I was actually accomplishing. Derek was reducing criminal investigation work to compliance and sophisticated forensic analysis to documentation. But I assumed he was simply more comfortable discussing sales achievements than law enforcement investigations, and I didn't want to make him feel overshadowed by my professional recognition. My expertise continued expanding as Meridian's operations became more complex. We were acquiring smaller pharmaceutical companies, entering new international markets, and developing partnerships with research institutions that created intricate financial relationships requiring sophisticated oversight. Elena Vasquez was assigning me to increasingly complex scenarios that combined elements of corporate finance, regulatory compliance, and criminal investigation. You've developed into our most valuable asset for financial risk management, Elena told me during my annual performance review. Your ability to identify threats that others miss is protecting this company from potentially devastating losses. I'm recommending you for promotion to Senior Forensic Accountant with expanded responsibilities for all corporate acquisition due diligence. The promotion meant I would be responsible for investigating the financial integrity of companies that Meridian was considering for acquisition or partnership. It was sophisticated work that required analyzing foreign accounting systems, understanding international regulatory frameworks, and detecting fraud schemes that operated across multiple jurisdictions. My first major assignment was evaluating a German pharmaceutical research company that Meridian was considering acquiring for $45 million. The due diligence process required me to spend 3 weeks in Munich, working with international forensic accounting specialists to verify the company's financial statements and operational claims. What I discovered during that investigation saved Meridian from what would have been a catastrophic acquisition. The German company had been inflating their research and development achievements by claiming credit for work actually performed by subcontractors. Their patent portfolio, which represented most of their supposed value, was built on research they didn't own and couldn't legally commercialize. Your investigation prevented us from purchasing a company that was essentially fraudulent, Thompson Mitchell, Meridian's CEO, told me when I presented my findings to the board of directors. The $45 million we would have spent on this acquisition would have been a complete loss. Your expertise just saved us from one of the most expensive mistakes in company history. The German investigation established me as Meridian's primary resource for international fraud prevention and acquisition due diligence. Over the following months, I was assigned to evaluate potential partnerships in France, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Each investigation required me to understand different accounting standards, regulatory frameworks, and cultural approaches to business documentation. Derek's reaction to my international work was increasingly ambivalent. He was proud of my professional achievements and the recognition I was receiving from senior management, but he was also becoming uncomfortable with the complexity of my expertise. When I'd return from international investigations with detailed reports about sophisticated fraud schemes or regulatory violations, Derek would listen politely but seemed overwhelmed by the technical complexity. "I'm glad you're doing important work," he'd say, "but I have to admit I don't really understand most of what you're investigating. The compliance and regulatory stuff is so specialized that it's hard for me to follow the details." I appreciated his honesty, but I also noticed that Derek was gradually becoming less interested in discussing my professional achievements. Instead of the detailed conversations we used to have about our respective work, he'd ask general questions about my projects before transitioning to discussions of his own sales activities. "How was the investigation in London?" he'd ask. "Complex, but I found evidence of systematic revenue manipulation that could have cost us millions," I'd respond. "That's great, honey. I'm glad you caught it. Speaking of international business, I'm working on a deal with a Canadian hospital chain that could be huge for our expansion strategy." The pattern was subtle but consistent. Derek would acknowledge my work briefly, then redirect conversations toward topics where he felt more knowledgeable and comfortable. My expertise was becoming so specialized that it was creating distance in our professional partnership, even as it was advancing my individual career significantly. By the end of my 5th year at Meridian, I had established myself as one of the leading forensic accountants in pharmaceutical industry fraud prevention. My techniques were being adopted by companies across the healthcare sector, my testimony was sought by federal prosecutors handling healthcare fraud cases, and my recommendations were influencing regulatory policy at the national level. But as my professional reputation was reaching new heights, I was beginning to realize that Derek's understanding of my work was becoming increasingly superficial. The partnership that had once been built on mutual expertise and shared insights was gradually becoming asymmetrical, with Derek's knowledge of my capabilities lagging behind the reality of what I was accomplishing. I didn't yet understand that this growing gap between my actual expertise and Derek's perception of my work would eventually create the conditions for the humiliation I was about to experience. The woman whose forensic skills were being recognized nationally was about to be dismissed as someone who handled routine paperwork. Despite the subtle shifts in Derek's understanding of my work, I continued supporting his career development with the same dedication that had characterized our partnership from the beginning. When he was selected for Meridian's Advanced Sales Leadership Program, I spent weeks helping him prepare for the intensive training that would qualify him for senior management positions. The program required participants to develop comprehensive market analysis presentations that demonstrated their understanding of pharmaceutical industry trends, competitive positioning, and strategic growth opportunities. Derek's natural relationship-building skills were exceptional, but analytical research had never been his strength. That's where my forensic accounting expertise became invaluable. I need to present a 5-year market projection for Midwest hospital systems, Derek explained one evening, spreading program materials across our dining room table. They want analysis of market size, competitive dynamics, and growth opportunities, but I'm not sure how to approach the data analysis component. I spent the next 3 weekends helping Derek develop analytical frameworks that would support his market projections. Using my forensic investigation techniques, I researched hospital acquisition trends, analyzed competitor financial performance, and identified market patterns that revealed expansion opportunities Derek's sales experience might not have detected. Look at the procurement spending patterns for hospital systems in Ohio and Illinois, I showed him, highlighting data I'd compiled from public financial reports. They're increasing capital expenditure on pharmaceutical partnerships by an average of 18% annually, but they're concentrating those investments with fewer vendors. This suggests opportunity for market share expansion if we can position Meridian as a preferred long-term partner. Derek incorporated my analysis into his presentation, and it became one of the standout projects in the leadership program. His ability to support strategic projections with sophisticated data analysis impressed the program instructors and distinguished his work from other participants who relied primarily on anecdotal evidence and industry assumptions. "Your research was incredible," Derek told me after receiving recognition for the highest-scoring presentation in his cohort. "The way you identified those market patterns gave me insights that none of the other participants had access to. I couldn't have developed that level of analytical depth without your expertise." But even as Derek appreciated my contributions to his career advancement, I noticed changes in how he characterized my involvement to colleagues and supervisors. During the program's final presentations, when participants were asked to acknowledge their preparation methods, Derek mentioned that he'd received analytical support from his wife, who works in our finance department, rather than specifying that I was a forensic accountant with specialized expertise in industry analysis. The characterization bothered me because it reduced my sophisticated analytical work to generic support, while obscuring the specialized skills that had made his presentation successful. But I assumed Derek was trying to take appropriate credit for his own achievements, rather than appearing to rely too heavily on outside assistance. My support for Derek's career development extended beyond academic preparation. When he was assigned to manage Meridian's relationship with a major hospital chain that had been experiencing procurement fraud problems, I helped him understand the compliance and security concerns that would be central to their vendor selection process. Regional Medical Systems has been dealing with vendor kickback schemes that cost them over $3 million last year, I explained, sharing research I'd conducted about their procurement challenges. Their new vendor evaluation criteria prioritize partners who can demonstrate sophisticated fraud prevention capabilities and transparent billing practices. I developed a comprehensive fraud prevention presentation that Derek could use to demonstrate Meridian's security protocols and compliance systems. The presentation detailed our vendor verification processes, financial monitoring capabilities, and regulatory compliance frameworks in ways that directly addressed Regional Medical Systems' security concerns. Derek's client meetings with regional medical systems were successful partly because he could speak knowledgeably about fraud prevention measures that competing pharmaceutical companies couldn't match. My behind-the-scenes research and analytical support had given him expertise in areas that were crucial to the client's decision-making process but weren't covered in traditional sales training. The regional medical deal is going to be worth over $15 million over 3 years, Derek announced after the final contract negotiations. They specifically mentioned being impressed by our fraud prevention capabilities and compliance systems. Your background information was essential for understanding what they needed to hear. However, when Derek reported his success to Meridian's sales leadership, he described the victory in terms of relationship building and strategic positioning, rather than acknowledging the analytical research that had informed his client presentations. His colleagues heard about his negotiation skills and market knowledge, but not about the forensic expertise that had made his fraud prevention discussions credible. This pattern continued as Derek's career advanced. I would provide analytical support, industry research, and technical expertise that enhanced his performance, but his public characterization of that support became increasingly generic. My forensic accounting skills were being reduced to research assistance, and my sophisticated analytical work was being described as helpful background information. The most significant example came when Derek was competing for promotion to regional sales director, a position that would give him management responsibility for pharmaceutical sales across 5 states. The promotion process required candidates to develop strategic plans for market expansion that demonstrated understanding of regulatory environments, competitive threats, and growth opportunities. I spent over a month helping Derek research regulatory changes affecting pharmaceutical sales in each target state, analyze competitor positioning strategies, and identify market vulnerabilities that could be leveraged for expansion. My forensic investigation techniques allowed me to detect patterns in competitor behavior that revealed their strategic priorities and potential weaknesses. The regulatory changes in Michigan are creating opportunities that our competitors haven't recognized yet, I explained to Derek, showing him analysis I developed by cross-referencing state regulatory filings with pharmaceutical companies' strategic reports. New compliance requirements are increasing administrative burdens for companies that don't have sophisticated internal controls. We can position Meridian as the partner that helps hospitals navigate these complexities, while competitors are still struggling to understand the requirements. Derek's strategic plan incorporated insights from my regulatory analysis, competitive intelligence, and market opportunity assessment. When he presented his expansion strategy to Meridian's executive committee, the depth and sophistication of his analysis impressed senior leadership and distinguished his proposal from competing candidates. Derek's strategic thinking demonstrates exactly the kind of analytical depth we need for regional leadership, Elena Vasquez commented during the evaluation process. His understanding of regulatory implications and competitive dynamics shows that he can think beyond traditional sales approaches to identify sustainable growth opportunities. Derek was promoted to regional sales director, earning a significant salary increase and management responsibilities that positioned him for potential advancement to national leadership roles. The promotion was a major career achievement that validated his professional development and established him as one of Meridian's rising executives. But when Derek announced his promotion to colleagues and celebrated with the sales team, he characterized his success in terms of sales performance and leadership potential. The analytical work I'd contributed was mentioned only briefly as research support that had helped him develop his strategic plan. I've been focused on understanding market dynamics and competitive positioning, Derek explained to his new team during his first management meeting. The strategic analysis that earned me this promotion came from developing deeper insights into regulatory trends and growth opportunities across our target markets. The omission of my contributions wasn't intentionally deceptive, but it reflected Derek's evolving perception of our professional partnership. My specialized expertise was becoming invisible to him, reduced to background support rather than collaborative partnership. The forensic skills that were gaining national recognition in my own field were being characterized as routine research assistance in Derek's career narrative. As Derek's responsibilities expanded with his promotion, he began spending more time with other senior managers and less time discussing the detailed analytical work that had supported his advancement. Our evening conversations shifted from collaborative strategy discussions to Derek sharing updates about management challenges and organizational dynamics that didn't require my technical input. The regional team has some performance issues I need to address, Derek would say when I asked about his new responsibilities. It's mostly about managing people and coordinating resources rather than the kind of technical analysis work you do. The characterization revealed how Derek's perception of our respective roles had evolved. He saw his work as strategic management that required leadership skills and business intuition, while my work was being categorized as technical analysis that supported but didn't drive business decisions. I continued providing analytical support when Derek requested it, but I was beginning to recognize that our professional partnership was becoming asymmetrical in ways that diminished my contributions while amplifying his achievements. The woman whose forensic expertise was informing Derek's strategic decisions was gradually being repositioned as someone who provided research assistance rather than collaborative expertise. The foundation was being laid for the complete dismissal I would soon experience, where Derek's perception of my professional value had deteriorated so completely that he could characterize my work as routine administrative tasks in front of his colleagues. The partnership that had once been built on mutual respect and shared expertise was becoming a relationship where my contributions were invisible and my capabilities were underestimated. The case that would define my reputation as a forensic accountant began with a phone call that interrupted what should have been a quiet Thursday afternoon in March. Dr. Sarah Kim from the Illinois Department of Health was calling about irregularities they'd detected in Medicaid billing patterns that involved several pharmaceutical companies, including Meridian Industries. Ms. Morrison, we've been tracking unusual prescription fulfillment patterns that suggest systematic fraud in pharmaceutical Medicaid reimbursements, Dr. Kim explained. Your reputation for healthcare fraud investigation made you our first call. We need someone with your expertise to determine whether these patterns represent isolated billing errors or coordinated criminal activity. The preliminary data Dr. Kim shared was alarming. Over the past 18 months, Medicaid prescription fulfillment for certain high-cost medications had increased by over 400% in specific geographic regions, but the patient populations in those areas hadn't grown correspondingly. Either there was an unprecedented medical crisis affecting those communities, or someone was manipulating prescription data to generate fraudulent Medicaid reimbursements. The billing patterns are too precise to be coincidental, I told Dr. Kim after reviewing the initial data. The geographic concentration, the timing of prescription increases, and the specific medications involved all suggest intentional manipulation rather than legitimate medical trends. What I discovered during the following 6 weeks of investigation was the most sophisticated Medicaid fraud scheme I'd ever encountered. A network of fake clinics, phantom patients, and corrupted prescription databases was generating millions of dollars in fraudulent reimbursements by creating false medical records that justified prescriptions for expensive medications that were never actually dispensed to real patients. The scheme worked by exploiting vulnerabilities in the data sharing systems between healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies, and Medicaid administrators. Fake clinics would submit prescription requests for phantom patients using stolen identity information. Corrupted pharmacy systems would confirm prescription fulfillment without actually dispensing medications. Pharmaceutical companies would bill Medicaid for medications that existed only in fraudulent databases. My forensic analysis revealed that the network had processed over $63 million in fraudulent Medicaid reimbursements across 4 states. The sophistication required coordination between healthcare providers, pharmacy systems, pharmaceutical distributors, and Medicaid processing centers. This wasn't opportunistic fraud, it was organized crime operating within legitimate healthcare infrastructure. Ms. Morrison, your investigation has uncovered what appears to be the largest Medicaid prescription fraud scheme in federal law enforcement history, Special Agent Michael Rodriguez from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit told me during our initial briefing. The analytical techniques you use to trace these fraudulent transactions across multiple state systems are exactly what we need to prosecute this case successfully. The federal investigation that followed involved over 200 FBI agents, healthcare fraud investigators, and forensic accountants across multiple states. My role was serving as the lead forensic analyst responsible for tracing financial flows, documenting evidence of coordination between criminal participants, and calculating the total scope of fraudulent activity. Working with federal investigators required me to develop new analytical techniques for tracking criminal proceeds through complex networks of legitimate and illegitimate business entities. The criminals had used shell companies, nominee accounts, and cryptocurrency transactions to obscure the movement of stolen Medicaid funds. My forensic reconstruction of these financial flows required expertise that combined traditional accounting investigation with cutting-edge digital financial analysis. Natalie's work is redefining how we approach complex financial crimes in healthcare, Agent Rodriguez commented during a federal briefing. Her ability to trace criminal proceeds through multiple jurisdictions and financial systems is providing evidence that we never could have developed using traditional investigation methods. The case culminated in federal indictments against 47 individuals and the seizure of over $80 million in criminal proceeds. My forensic analysis was central to the prosecution's case, demonstrating how the criminal network had operated across state boundaries and proving the coordination that elevated the charges from individual fraud to organized criminal conspiracy. But the professional recognition that followed was unprecedented. The Department of Justice invited me to join their healthcare fraud prevention task force as a consulting expert. The National Association of Forensic Accountants awarded me their Distinguished Achievement Award for contributions to healthcare fraud prevention. 3 federal agencies offered me permanent positions with salaries that would have tripled my income at Meridian Industries. Miss Morrison's forensic work has set new standards for healthcare fraud investigation that will influence federal policy for years to come, wrote Attorney General Patricia Henderson in a letter recognizing my contributions to the case. Her analytical innovations are protecting healthcare systems from criminal exploitation while ensuring that legitimate medical providers and patients aren't harmed by overly broad enforcement actions. The case also established me as a national expert in pharmaceutical fraud prevention. I was invited to testify before congressional committees investigating healthcare fraud, speak at law enforcement conferences about emerging criminal techniques, and consult with pharmaceutical companies developing fraud prevention protocols. Derek's reaction to this recognition was complex. He was genuinely proud of my achievements and the attention they brought to my professional capabilities. When news coverage of the federal case mentioned my role in the investigation, Derek would share the articles with colleagues and acknowledge my expertise in healthcare fraud prevention. My wife was the lead forensic accountant on that major Medicaid fraud case you might have read about, he'd tell people when the topic came up in conversation. She's been working with the FBI and other federal agencies on some pretty sophisticated criminal investigations. But I also noticed that Derek seemed somewhat overwhelmed by the complexity and visibility of what I was accomplishing. The federal case had involved criminal enterprises, organized crime networks, and financial techniques that were far removed from the pharmaceutical sales environment where Derek had built his expertise. When I tried to share details about the investigative techniques I'd developed or the policy implications of the case findings, Derek would listen politely but often seemed lost in the technical complexity. The collaborative discussions we used to have about our respective work were becoming more one-sided, with Derek asking general questions about my projects but offering fewer insights or suggestions. The federal investigation work sounds incredibly important, Derek would say when I tried to explain the analytical challenges I was facing, but I have to admit, most of the technical details are beyond what I can really contribute to. It's so specialized compared to the business development work I'm focused on. I appreciated Derek's honesty about the limits of his expertise, but I was also beginning to feel professionally isolated in ways that hadn't existed during our earlier years at Meridian. My work was becoming so specialized and high-profile that it was difficult to maintain the collaborative partnership that had once characterized our relationship. The federal case also created practical challenges for our routine interactions at Meridian. Because my investigation had involved multiple pharmaceutical companies, I was required to maintain strict confidentiality about methods and findings that might affect ongoing prosecutions. Much of my work was classified at levels that prevented me from sharing details even with Derek. I can't really talk about what I'm working on right now. I'd have to tell him when he'd ask about my current projects. There are federal confidentiality requirements that restrict what I can discuss until the prosecutions are completed. These confidentiality constraints created distance in our professional relationship that hadn't existed before. Derek was used to understanding the details of my forensic work and offering input based on his business experience. Suddenly, much of what I was doing was off-limits for discussion, even with my husband. Over time, I think Derek began to perceive my specialized work as something separate from Meridian's regular business operations, rather than expertise that enhanced the company's capabilities. The federal investigations, policy work, and law enforcement consulting were impressive achievements, but they were also taking me further away from the day-to-day corporate environment where Derek built his understanding of business operations. "Your federal work is amazing," Derek told me after I returned from testifying before a congressional subcommittee, "but it's getting pretty far from the regular business world where most of us work. I'm sure it's important for national policy, but it's hard for me to see how it connects to what we're doing here at Meridian." That comment revealed how Derek's perception of my work was evolving. Instead of seeing my federal recognition as validation of expertise that benefited Meridian Industries, he was beginning to view it as specialized government work that was disconnected from corporate business operations. The irony was that my federal investigations had actually strengthened Meridian's fraud prevention capabilities and enhanced our reputation with healthcare providers who were concerned about vendor security. My work was directly benefiting the company's business relationships, but Derek was losing sight of those connections as my expertise became more specialized and publicly recognized. Without realizing it, Derek was beginning the mental process that would eventually allow him to dismiss my professional capabilities as routine administrative work. The woman whose forensic expertise was being recognized at the federal level was gradually being repositioned in Derek's mind as someone whose work was disconnected from practical business operations. The foundation was being established for the complete professional dismissal I would experience when Derek's perception of my capabilities had become so distorted that he could characterize federal-level forensic work as basic data entry in front of his colleagues. The dynamic that would ultimately destroy our professional partnership arrived in the form of Marcus Webb, Meridian's new vice president of strategic development. Marcus joined the company 6 months after my federal case concluded, brought in from a major consulting firm to lead Meridian's expansion into international pharmaceutical markets. From his first day, Marcus commanded attention in ways that were both impressive and unsettling. Tall, impeccably dressed, and possessing the kind of confident charisma that filled conference rooms, he had the ability to make complex business strategies sound not just logical, but inevitable. His MBA from Harvard Business School and his previous experience leading international expansions for Fortune 500 companies gave him credibility that was immediately recognized by Meridian executive leadership. Marcus brings exactly the kind of strategic vision we need for global growth, Thomson Mitchell announced when introducing him to the senior management team. His experience with pharmaceutical market expansion in Europe and Asia will be invaluable as we position Meridian for international success. Derek was immediately drawn to Marcus's combination of strategic thinking and executive presence. Within weeks of Marcus's arrival, Derek was seeking opportunities to work with his team, volunteering for projects that would demonstrate his capabilities to someone who clearly had influence with senior leadership. "Marcus is revolutionizing how we think about market expansion," Derek told me after attending his first strategy meeting with the new VP. "He doesn't just look at sales opportunities, he analyzes entire market ecosystems and identifies leverage points that can drive sustainable growth. It's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that separates successful companies from their competitors." I was curious about this executive who was generating such enthusiasm, but my initial interactions with Marcus were limited to brief encounters in meetings or casual conversations in Meridian's executive areas. He was pleasant enough in these superficial interactions, acknowledging my role in the company with the kind of professional courtesy that senior executives typically showed to specialized staff members. "Natalie, right? You're our forensic accounting expert," Marcus said during one early conversation. "I've heard you do excellent work in compliance and fraud prevention. That's exactly the kind of risk management expertise we need as we expand internationally." The characterization was respectful but revealing. Marcus immediately positioned my forensic work as compliance and fraud prevention, rather than the sophisticated criminal investigation and policy development that had earned me federal recognition. He saw me as a specialized staff member who handled risk management, rather than a strategic contributor who could influence business decision-making. But Marcus's real impact on our marriage became apparent through his influence on Derek's career development. Within 2 months of joining Meridian, Marcus had identified Derek as someone with high potential for international business development. He began including Derek in strategic planning meetings, international market analysis projects, and executive development initiatives that were typically reserved for senior management. Marcus wants me to lead the preliminary assessment for our European expansion, Derek announced one evening, barely containing his excitement. He thinks my understanding of pharmaceutical sales relationships and market dynamics makes me ideal for evaluating partnership opportunities with European healthcare systems. The opportunity was significant for Derek's career, representing exactly the kind of strategic project that could accelerate his advancement to senior executive positions. But Marcus's mentorship came with subtle implications about the kind of thinking and expertise that were valuable for corporate leadership. International business development requires a different kind of strategic mindset than domestic operations, Marcus told Derek during one of their planning meetings, his voice carrying enough volume to be heard by nearby colleagues. You need to think beyond traditional sales approaches and understand how global markets, regulatory environments, and competitive dynamics create opportunities for systematic growth. The message was clear. Strategic thinking that drove corporate success was different from, and superior to, specialized technical expertise that supported operational functions. Marcus was positioning Derek as someone with strategic potential, while implicitly categorizing technical specialists as valuable but fundamentally limited contributors to business success. Derek absorbed these lessons eagerly, and I began noticing changes in how he discussed business challenges and opportunities. Instead of collaborative conversations where we'd combine his relationship-building insights with my analytical expertise, Derek started speaking about strategic thinking as a distinctly executive capability that was separate from technical analysis. The European expansion project requires understanding market positioning and competitive dynamics at a level that goes beyond traditional financial analysis, Derek explained when I offered to help with research. Marcus says successful international development depends on strategic vision rather than detailed data analysis. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus was teaching Derek that executive-level strategic thinking was fundamentally different from the analytical work that had once been central to our collaboration. My forensic expertise, which had previously enhanced Derek's business understanding, was being repositioned as detailed technical work that was less relevant to strategic decision-making. Marcus's impact extended beyond Derek's individual development. He was reshaping the culture within Meridian's sales and development departments, emphasizing strategic vision and market intuition over analytical rigor and operational expertise. The message was consistent. Successful executives were those who could see the big picture rather than getting bogged down in technical details. Marcus believes that too much focus on compliance and risk management can actually limit a company's growth potential, Derek told me after one of their mentoring sessions. He says successful international expansion requires strategic boldness rather than excessive caution about regulatory details and financial controls. The philosophy was seductive and dangerous. Marcus was encouraging executives to prioritize aggressive growth strategies over the careful risk assessment that had protected Meridian from the kinds of financial disasters I'd spent years preventing. He was positioning analytical caution as an obstacle to success rather than a foundation for sustainable growth. But Marcus's most significant impact was on Derek's perception of our professional relationship. Under Marcus's mentorship, Derek began seeing our marriage as a partnership between a strategic executive and a technical specialist rather than the collaboration between equals that had once characterized our relationship. Marcus says one of the challenges for executives is maintaining strategic focus when family members work in operational roles, Derek mentioned casually one evening. He thinks it's important that I don't let detailed technical concerns distract from the kind of big-picture thinking that drives successful leadership. The comment revealed how completely Marcus had reframed Derek's understanding of my professional value. Instead of seeing my expertise as analytical capabilities that enhanced strategic decision-making, Derek was being taught to view my work as detailed technical concerns that could distract from executive-level thinking. Marcus Webb had arrived at Meridian Industries and systematically begun dismantling the foundation of mutual respect and collaboration that Derek and I had built over 8 years of partnership. He was teaching Derek that strategic success required moving beyond the kind of analytical rigor that had once been central to our relationship, positioning himself as the mentor who could elevate Derek's thinking to executive levels that transcended technical limitations. The stage was being set for the complete dismissal of my professional value that would soon devastate our marriage and ultimately expose the fundamental flaws in Marcus's approach to business leadership. Over the following months, Marcus's influence on Derek became increasingly systematic and destructive to our professional relationship. What had started as mentorship evolved into a comprehensive campaign to reshape Derek's understanding of business value, with my analytical expertise being repositioned as a limitation rather than an asset. The transformation accelerated when Marcus assigned Derek to lead a feasibility study for Meridian's potential acquisition of a Swiss pharmaceutical research company. The project represented exactly the kind of strategic initiative that could establish Derek as a candidate for senior executive positions, but it also required the kind of complex financial analysis that had always been my specialty. This acquisition could position Meridian as a leader in European pharmaceutical research, Derek explained when he first received the assignment. Marcus wants me to evaluate everything: market positioning, regulatory implications, competitive advantages, financial projections. It's the most comprehensive strategic analysis I've ever been asked to lead. In the past, Derek would have immediately sought my collaboration on such a complex project. My forensic expertise in evaluating financial statements, detecting fraud risks, and assessing regulatory compliance would have been invaluable for analyzing a foreign acquisition target. But Marcus had been teaching Derek that executive-level strategic thinking required moving beyond detailed analytical approaches. Marcus says the key to successful acquisition analysis is understanding strategic value rather than getting bogged down in operational details, Derek told me when I offered to help with the financial evaluation. He thinks executives need to focus on vision and market opportunity rather than spending too much time on technical due diligence. The philosophy was troubling because it ignored the fundamental importance of financial integrity in acquisition decisions. My forensic work had repeatedly demonstrated that companies could present impressive strategic narratives while hiding operational problems that made acquisitions financially disastrous. Marcus was encouraging Derek to prioritize vision over verification, exactly the kind of approach that led to catastrophic business mistakes. But Derek was completely convinced by Marcus's strategic framework. Instead of collaborating with me on financial analysis, he spent weeks developing market positioning presentations and competitive landscape assessments that emphasized the Swiss company's potential rather than rigorously evaluating their actual performance. "The strategic opportunity is incredible," Derek reported after visiting the Swiss company's facilities. "They have breakthrough research capabilities that could revolutionize Meridian's product development pipeline." Marcus says this is exactly the kind of visionary acquisition that separates successful companies from those that get stuck in analytical paralysis. When Derek presented his acquisition recommendation to Meridian's executive committee, Marcus was effusive in his praise for the strategic thinking Derek had demonstrated. "This is exactly the kind of executive-level analysis that drives successful corporate growth," Marcus announced to the committee. Derek has shown that he can think beyond traditional operational constraints to identify transformational opportunities. But Elena Vasquez, my boss and the company's CFO, had concerns about the financial aspects of Derek's analysis. During the executive review, she asked pointed questions about the Swiss company's revenue verification, research and development accounting practices, and regulatory compliance history, exactly the areas where my forensic expertise would have been invaluable. "Derek, your strategic analysis is impressive," Elena said during the presentation, "but I'm concerned about some gaps in the financial due diligence. The revenue projections seem optimistic given their historical performance, and I'd like to see more rigorous verification of their research assets and intellectual property claims." Marcus immediately positioned Elena's concerns as exactly the kind of excessive caution that limited corporate growth potential. "Elena raises valid operational questions," he acknowledged, "but we have to balance analytical rigor with strategic boldness. If we spend too much time on detailed verification processes, we risk losing transformational opportunities to more decisive competitors. The exchange revealed the fundamental conflict between Marcus's philosophy and the analytical rigor that had always characterized successful business operations at Meridian. Marcus was teaching Derek that executive success required moving quickly on strategic opportunities, while Elena understood that financial analysis prevented costly mistakes that could destroy companies. Derek absorbed Marcus's lessons completely, and his attitude toward analytical expertise became increasingly dismissive. When Elena assigned me to conduct a preliminary financial review of the Swiss acquisition target, Derek actually seemed annoyed rather than appreciative. "I thought we've moved beyond needing detailed financial analysis for strategic decisions," Derek told me. "Marcus says successful executives need to be able to make decisions based on strategic vision rather than waiting for exhaustive analytical reports." The comment revealed how completely Derek's perception of financial analysis had changed under Marcus's influence. Work that had once been valuable collaboration was now seen as bureaucratic delay that interfered with executive decision-making. My expertise had been transformed from strategic asset to operational obstacle. Marcus's systematic undermining extended to social and professional interactions throughout Meridian. During executive meetings, he would consistently emphasize the difference between strategic thinkers who drove growth and analytical specialists who provided operational support. The distinction was subtle but persistent, creating a hierarchy that positioned executives as visionaries and analysts as technical staff. The challenge for growing companies is maintaining strategic momentum while managing operational complexity, Marcus would say during leadership discussions. "We need executives who can see the big picture and specialists who can handle the detailed implementation work." The framework positioned Derek as someone with executive potential, while implicitly categorizing me as a specialist whose work supported but didn't drive business strategy. Marcus was teaching the entire executive team that strategic leadership was fundamentally different from and superior to analytical expertise. But Marcus's most damaging influence was on Derek's perception of our marriage. During their private mentoring conversations, Marcus would discuss the challenges that executives faced when family members worked in operational roles within the same organization. "It's important for emerging executives to maintain clear boundaries between strategic responsibilities and family relationships," Derek reported after one of these conversations. Marcus says successful leaders need to be able to make objective business decisions without being influenced by personal considerations or technical concerns that might limit strategic thinking. The advice was positioning our professional partnership as a potential conflict of interest rather than a collaborative advantage. Marcus was teaching Derek that executive success required distancing himself from the analytical perspectives that had once enhanced his business understanding. Over the course of 6 months, Marcus had systematically dismantled the foundation of mutual respect and collaboration that had characterized Derek's and my professional relationship. He had repositioned strategic vision as superior to analytical rigor, executive thinking as more valuable than technical expertise, and business boldness as more important than careful risk assessment. Derek had absorbed these lessons completely, transforming from a partner who valued my forensic expertise into someone who saw my work as detailed technical analysis that was fundamentally separate from strategic business leadership. The man who had once appreciated my contributions to his career development was now being taught that executive success required moving beyond the analytical approaches that had always been my strength. Marcus Webb had successfully executed a campaign to isolate Derek from my professional influence, while positioning himself as the mentor who could elevate Derek's thinking to executive levels. The stage was set for the complete dismissal of my professional value that would soon shatter our marriage and expose the catastrophic flaws in Marcus's strategic philosophy. The opportunity for my public humiliation was orchestrated with the same strategic precision that Marcus applied to all his corporate initiatives. In late September, Thomson Mitchell announced that Meridian's quarterly leadership meeting would feature a special presentation format designed to showcase the company's diverse talent and collaborative culture. We're going to demonstrate how different departments work together to drive Meridian's success, Thomson explained during the announcement. Each senior manager will present their team's contributions, and we'll have representatives from supporting departments discuss how their expertise enhances our strategic initiatives. Marcus immediately saw the presentation format as an opportunity to reinforce his philosophy about the hierarchy between strategic leadership and operational support. During the planning meetings, he suggested that Derek present the international expansion initiatives, while I could provide brief comments about the financial analysis components. This is perfect timing, Marcus told Derek during one of their preparation sessions, his voice carrying across the conference room where several colleagues were working. You can demonstrate your strategic thinking about international markets, and Natalie can explain how her accounting work supports the analytical requirements. The characterization was deliberately diminishing. Marcus was positioning Derek as someone who demonstrated strategic thinking, while I would be explaining how my work supported analytical requirements, reducing my forensic expertise to administrative assistance for Derek's strategic initiatives. Derek absorbed Marcus's framing completely, and when he discussed the presentation format with me, he unconsciously adopted the same hierarchical language. I'll be presenting our European expansion strategy, he said, and Marcus thought it would be good if you could talk about the financial analysis components that support strategic decision-making. The characterization was deliberately diminishing. Marcus was positioning Derek as someone who demonstrated strategic thinking, while I would be explaining how my work supported analytical requirements, reducing my forensic expertise to administrative assistance for Derek's strategic initiatives. Derek absorbed Marcus's framing completely, and when he discussed the presentation format with me, he unconsciously adopted the same hierarchical language. I'll be presenting our European expansion strategy, he said, and Marcus thought it would be good if you could talk about the financial analysis components that support strategic decision-making. I was immediately concerned by the setup. My forensic investigation of the Swiss pharmaceutical company had revealed serious problems with their financial statements and regulatory compliance, problems that directly contradicted Derek's optimistic strategic assessment. If I was being asked to discuss my analytical findings, I would have to present information that undermined Derek's conclusions about the acquisition opportunity. Derek, my financial analysis found significant issues with the Swiss company's revenue recognition and research asset valuation, I told him. Their financial statements show patterns that suggest systematic misrepresentation of their actual performance. I'm concerned that the strategic opportunity you've identified might not be supported by their operational reality. But Derek had been thoroughly indoctrinated by Marcus's philosophy that analytical concerns shouldn't limit strategic vision. Instead of being alarmed by my findings, Derek seemed annoyed that I was raising technical objections to what he saw as a transformational business opportunity. Marcus says successful executives need to balance analytical input with strategic intuition, Derek responded. Obviously, we'll want to verify their financial information eventually, but we can't let detailed compliance concerns prevent us from recognizing genuine opportunities for growth. The comment revealed how completely Derek's thinking had been reshaped by Marcus's influence. My forensic analysis wasn't being treated as crucial intelligence that could prevent a catastrophic acquisition. It was being dismissed as detailed compliance concerns that interfered with strategic decision-making. Marcus had structured the presentation format to reinforce this dynamic publicly. Derek would present strategic vision that demonstrated executive-level thinking, while I would discuss analytical details that supported but didn't drive business decisions. The setup was designed to showcase Marcus's philosophy about the relationship between strategic leadership and operational expertise. But Marcus's most calculated move was ensuring that the presentation would include Meridian's senior leadership, major clients, and potential investors. The quarterly meeting had been expanded to include hospital system administrators, pharmaceutical industry analysts, and European business development contacts who were evaluating Meridian as a potential partner. This presentation is crucial for demonstrating Meridian's strategic capabilities to external stakeholders, Marcus explained to Derek. Your analysis of international opportunities will show that we have the executive talent necessary for global expansion. It's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that convinces investors and clients that Meridian is ready for the next level of growth. The audience would include people whose opinions could influence Derek's career trajectory and Meridian's business relationships. Marcus was creating a high-stakes environment where Derek would be motivated to present optimistic strategic conclusions rather than acknowledging analytical concerns that might undermine his executive credibility. 3 days before the presentation, I completed my comprehensive forensic report on the Swiss pharmaceutical company. The findings were damning: systematic revenue manipulation, fraudulent research asset valuations, and regulatory compliance violations that could expose Meridian to criminal liability if we proceeded with the acquisition. Derek, you need to see this report before your presentation, I told him, handing over documentation that proved the Swiss company was essentially a sophisticated fraud scheme disguised as a legitimate research operation. The financial evidence shows they've been misrepresenting their capabilities and performance for at least 3 years. This isn't a strategic opportunity, it's a trap that could destroy Meridian's reputation and financial stability. But Derek was so committed to Marcus's strategic framework that he couldn't process information that contradicted his optimistic assessment. Instead of reviewing my forensic findings carefully, he skimmed through the report and dismissed it as excessive analytical caution that was interfering with strategic vision. Natalie, I appreciate your thoroughness, but Marcus has been clear that successful executives can't let analytical paralysis prevent decisive action, Derek said, setting aside my report without serious consideration. Obviously, we'll want to verify some of these details eventually, but I can't present findings that undermine the strategic opportunity I've been asked to evaluate. The response revealed how completely Marcus had corrupted Derek's business judgment. My forensic evidence of systematic fraud was being characterized as analytical paralysis, while Derek's uninformed optimism was being elevated as strategic vision. Marcus had taught Derek to prioritize presentation over truth, strategic narrative over analytical reality. On the morning of the quarterly meeting, I made one final attempt to prevent Derek from presenting conclusions that would embarrass him and potentially damage Meridian's business relationships. Derek, if you present the Swiss acquisition as a strategic opportunity without acknowledging the fraud evidence I've documented, you're going to be exposed when the truth comes out. This isn't about analytical caution, it's about protecting yourself and the company from criminal liability. But Derek was completely insulated from reality by Marcus's strategic philosophy. Marcus says executives need to have confidence in their strategic vision, Derek replied. I can't let detailed technical concerns undermine the presentation I've been asked to deliver. The strategic opportunity is real, and that's what matters for demonstrating executive-level thinking. As we walked toward the conference room where 70 executives, clients, and potential investors were waiting to hear Derek's strategic analysis, I realized that Marcus had orchestrated a perfect storm of professional humiliation. Derek would present fraudulent information as strategic opportunity. I would be positioned to provide analytical support for conclusions that my investigation had proven false, and the entire disaster would unfold in front of people whose opinions could determine both our career futures. Marcus Webb had created the ideal conditions for publicly demonstrating that his strategic philosophy was superior to my analytical expertise. He had no idea that my forensic investigation would provide Elena Vasquez with exactly the evidence she needed to expose the fundamental flaws in his approach to business leadership. The Meridian Industries quarterly leadership meeting convened in the largest conference room on the 32nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline and a presentation setup that could accommodate the 70 executives, clients, and potential investors who had gathered to hear strategic updates about the company's growth initiatives. Derek took his position at the front of the room with the confidence that Marcus had been cultivating over months of mentorship. His presentation materials were professionally prepared, his suit was perfectly tailored, and his demeanor projected the kind of executive presence that Marcus had taught him was essential for strategic leadership. Today, I want to share our analysis of transformational opportunities in European pharmaceutical markets, Derek began, his voice carrying the authority that came from believing he was presenting visionary strategic thinking. Our evaluation of potential acquisition targets has identified partnerships that could revolutionize Meridian's international presence and research capabilities. The audience included hospital system administrators who were evaluating Meridian as a vendor partner, pharmaceutical industry analysts who influenced investment recommendations, and European business contacts who were considering collaborative relationships. These were exactly the stakeholders Derek needed to impress to advance his career and enhance Meridian's business prospects. Derek's presentation was polished and persuasive, emphasizing the strategic vision that Marcus had taught him to prioritize over analytical details. He discussed market opportunities in Switzerland, regulatory advantages of European partnerships, and competitive positioning that could establish Meridian as a global leader in pharmaceutical research. The Swiss pharmaceutical research sector offers unique advantages for companies with the strategic vision to recognize transformational opportunities, Derek explained, displaying charts that showed projected revenue growth and market expansion possibilities. Traditional analytical approaches might focus on operational details, but executive-level strategic thinking identifies partnerships that can redefine entire market landscapes. The language reflected Marcus's influence completely. Derek was positioning analytical approaches as limited and traditional, while characterizing his conclusions as executive-level strategic thinking. He was unconsciously reinforcing the hierarchy that Marcus had established between strategic vision and operational expertise. When Derek reached the section about specific acquisition targets, he presented the Swiss pharmaceutical company as exactly the kind of visionary opportunity that separated successful executives from those limited by excessive analytical caution. This partnership represents the perfect combination of established research capabilities and untapped market potential, he announced confidently. That was the moment Marcus had orchestrated. I'd like to ask Natalie Morrison from our forensic accounting team to discuss the analytical components that support strategic decision-making in international acquisitions, Derek said, gesturing toward where I was sitting in the back of the room. The characterization was precisely what Marcus had planned. Derek was presenting strategic vision while I would discuss analytical components that supported his conclusions. The setup positioned me as technical support for Derek's executive-level thinking rather than as an independent expert with potentially contradictory findings. But as I walked to the front of the conference room carrying the comprehensive forensic report that documented systematic fraud at Derek's target acquisition company, I realized that Marcus had miscalculated catastrophically. He had assumed that analytical expertise would always be subordinate to strategic vision, but he had never encountered forensic evidence that completely contradicted strategic assumptions.
Thank you, Derek, I said, taking the microphone and looking out at the audience of executives, clients, and investors who were expecting to hear technical details that supported Derek's optimistic strategic assessment. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the analytical findings that should inform our strategic decision-making about international acquisitions. Derek smiled confidently, expecting me to provide technical validation for the strategic vision he'd presented. Marcus looked pleased that his framework was being demonstrated so clearly: executive strategic thinking supported by operational analytical work. My forensic investigation of the Swiss pharmaceutical company has revealed systematic financial fraud that makes this acquisition target completely unsuitable for partnership, I announced, my voice carrying across the silent conference room. The company has been manipulating revenue recognition, falsifying research asset valuations, and violating regulatory compliance requirements for at least 3 years. The silence that followed was profound and devastating. Derek's confident smile disappeared as he processed what I had just said. Marcus's pleased expression transformed into shocked disbelief. 70 executives, clients, and potential investors were staring at Derek, who had just enthusiastically recommended partnering with a company I'd identified as a criminal enterprise.
The strategic opportunity Derek described doesn't exist, I continued, presenting forensic evidence that contradicted every element of his presentation. The research capabilities are fabricated, the market position is misrepresented, and the regulatory compliance is fraudulent. This isn't a transformational partnership, it's a sophisticated fraud scheme that could expose Meridian to criminal liability. The silence that followed was profound and devastating. Derek's confident smile disappeared as he processed what I had just said. Marcus's pleased expression transformed into shocked disbelief. 70 executives, clients, and potential investors were staring at Derek, who had just enthusiastically recommended partnering with a company I'd identified as a criminal enterprise. The strategic opportunity Derek described doesn't exist, I continued, presenting forensic evidence that contradicted every element of his presentation. The research capabilities are fabricated, the market position is misrepresented, and the regulatory compliance is fraudulent. This isn't a transformational partnership, it's a sophisticated fraud scheme that could expose Meridian to criminal liability. James Hartwell, the head of operations, who had dismissed my work as administrative support, was now leaning forward in his chair, fully focused on the forensic evidence I was presenting. Patricia Chen from Human Resources looked stunned as she realized that Derek's strategic analysis had been based on completely false information. But Derek's reaction was the most devastating. Instead of acknowledging the forensic evidence I'd presented, he tried to maintain the strategic framework that Marcus had taught him. Natalie's analytical approach is very thorough, he said, his voice carrying a nervous edge. But sometimes, excessive focus on compliance details can prevent executives from recognizing genuine strategic opportunities. The comment was exactly what Marcus had been teaching him. Analytical concerns shouldn't limit strategic vision. But in front of an audience of sophisticated business leaders who understood the implications of fraud allegations, Derek's dismissal of forensic evidence sounded incompetent rather than visionary. Derek, said Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a hospital administrator who was evaluating Meridian as a potential vendor, are you suggesting that we should ignore evidence of systematic fraud when making partnership decisions? Because if that's your approach to strategic thinking, it raises serious questions about Meridian's judgment and risk management capabilities. The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Marcus's strategic philosophy. When analytical expertise revealed criminal behavior, dismissing that evidence as excessive caution wasn't strategic vision. It was dangerous incompetence that could destroy business relationships and expose companies to catastrophic liability. Marcus tried to intervene, attempting to reframe the situation in terms of his hierarchy between strategic and operational thinking. Obviously, fraud allegations require investigation, he said, but we need to balance analytical findings with strategic assessment of market opportunities. But Elena Vasquez had been watching the entire exchange with the calculating attention of someone who understood exactly what was happening. As chief financial officer and a former forensic accountant herself, Elena recognized that Marcus's strategic philosophy was fundamentally flawed, and that Derek's dismissal of my forensic evidence was professionally disastrous. Elena stood up and walked to the front of the conference room, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the audience. I think there's been some confusion about the relationship between strategic decision-making and analytical expertise, she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from understanding both financial analysis and executive leadership. Derek looked relieved, expecting Elena to support the strategic framework that Marcus had been promoting. Marcus appeared confident that another executive would reinforce the hierarchy between strategic vision and operational analysis. But Elena's next words would shatter both their expectations and expose the catastrophic flaws in everything Marcus had been teaching Derek about business leadership.
Elena Vasquez commanded the conference room with the quiet authority that came from 15 years of executive leadership and deep expertise in both forensic accounting and corporate strategy. Her silver hair was pulled back in a professional chignon, her navy suit was impeccably tailored, and her eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had built her career on making complex decisions under pressure.
I want to clarify something fundamental about how successful companies make strategic decisions, Elena began, her voice carrying enough volume to reach every corner of the silent conference room. Forensic analysis isn't operational support for strategic thinking, it's the foundation that makes strategic thinking possible. Derek's confident posture began to waver as he realized that Elena wasn't supporting a framework Marcus had taught him. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that his carefully constructed hierarchy between strategic vision and analytical expertise was about to be challenged by someone with superior credentials and company authority. Natalie Morrison isn't just our forensic accountant, Elena continued, looking directly at Derek with an expression that combined disappointment with professional concern. She's one of the most respected fraud investigators in the pharmaceutical industry. Her work has been recognized by federal law enforcement agencies, cited in congressional testimony, and adopted as standard practice by companies across the healthcare sector. The audience of executives, clients, and potential investors was now fully focused on Elena's presentation, recognizing that they were witnessing a fundamental disagreement about business philosophy at the highest levels of Meridian's leadership. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the hospital administrator who had questioned Derek's judgment, was taking notes on what Elena was saying. When Natalie presents forensic evidence that a potential acquisition target is engaged in systematic fraud, that's not analytical caution limiting strategic vision, Elena said, her tone becoming sharper as she addressed Derek directly. That's expert intelligence preventing us from making decisions that could destroy this company's reputation, expose us to criminal liability, and eliminate the trust that our clients and partners have built with us over decades. Marcus attempted to interject, trying to maintain some version of his strategic framework. Obviously, fraud allegations are serious, he said, but successful executives need to balance analytical input with strategic intuition about market opportunities. Elena turned her attention to Marcus with the kind of focused intensity that made it clear she'd been waiting for this moment. Marcus, your approach to strategic decision-making is fundamentally flawed, she said, her words carrying across the silent conference room. You've been teaching our executives to dismiss analytical expertise as operational limitation, but analytical expertise is what protects companies from the kind of catastrophic mistakes that end careers and destroy shareholder value. The confrontation was unprecedented in Meridian's corporate culture. Senior executives didn't typically challenge each other so directly in front of external stakeholders, but Elena clearly believed that Marcus's influence on company decision-making had become dangerous enough to require public correction. The Swiss pharmaceutical company that Derek just recommended as a strategic opportunity is currently under investigation by European regulatory authorities for systematic fraud. Their research capabilities are fabricated, their financial statements are fraudulent, and their regulatory compliance is non-existent. If we had proceeded with this acquisition based on Derek's strategic assessment, we would have purchased a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. Derek's face went pale as he realized that his confident presentation had been based on completely false information that Elena and I had both tried to warn him about. The 70 executives, clients, and investors in the audience were now staring at him with expressions ranging from concern to professional alarm. How did Elena know about the European investigation? Derek asked quietly, his voice carrying a note of panic as he realized how completely he'd misunderstood the situation. Because competent executives verify information before making strategic decisions, Elena replied, her tone making it clear that Derek's question had revealed exactly the kind of judgment failure she was addressing. Natalie's forensic analysis identified fraud patterns that prompted me to contact European regulatory authorities directly. That's how strategic decision-making actually works. You combine expert analytical intelligence with comprehensive verification to make informed decisions. Marcus looked stunned as he realized that his strategic philosophy had led Derek to recommend a partnership with a company that was already under criminal investigation. The framework he'd been promoting, strategic vision unconstrained by analytical caution, had produced exactly the kind of catastrophic judgment failure that analytical expertise was designed to prevent. Derek, Elena said, focusing her attention on my husband with the kind of direct confrontation that Marcus had taught him to expect from operational staff, but never from executive peers. You just spent 30 minutes recommending a criminal enterprise to an audience that includes our most important clients and potential investors. You characterized evidence of systematic fraud as analytical caution that shouldn't limit strategic thinking. The room was completely silent as Elena's words registered with the audience. Hospital administrators who were evaluating Meridian as a vendor partner were reconsidering their confidence in the company's judgment. Pharmaceutical industry analysts were reassessing their investment recommendations. European business contacts were questioning whether Meridian had the competence necessary for international partnerships. But more fundamentally, Elena continued, you just publicly dismissed the expertise of one of the most accomplished forensic accountants in the pharmaceutical industry. You reduced federal-level criminal investigation work to compliance details that shouldn't influence executive decision-making. Elena paused, letting her words register with Derek, as stakeholders whose opinions could determine both our careers and Meridian's business prospects. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who was about to make a decision that would reshape corporate dynamics completely. Derek, I want you to understand something clearly, Elena said, her words carrying enough volume to be heard throughout the conference room. Natalie Morrison's forensic expertise just prevented this company from making a $47 million acquisition that would have exposed us to criminal prosecution and destroyed our reputation with every client and partner in this room. She gestured toward the audience of executives, clients, and investors who were now fully aware that Derek's strategic thinking had nearly led Meridian into partnership with a criminal enterprise. These stakeholders need to know that Meridian Industries makes strategic decisions based on rigorous analysis and expert intelligence, not on the kind of uninformed optimism you just demonstrated. Derek was now standing in front of 70 industry professionals who had just watched him dismiss forensic evidence of fraud as analytical limitation that shouldn't constrain strategic vision. The confident executive presence that Marcus had taught him to project had crumbled completely, replaced by the pale, shocked expression of someone who realized his career might be ending in real time. Elena looked directly at Derek with an expression that combined professional disappointment with personal concern for someone whose judgment had been catastrophically compromised. The woman you just characterized as someone who handles compliance details has expertise that you clearly don't understand and analytical capabilities that you obviously don't value. That's going to be a problem for your future effectiveness at this company. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elena was indicating that Derek's dismissal of analytical expertise and his willingness to recommend criminal enterprises as strategic opportunities had raised fundamental questions about his fitness for executive responsibilities at Meridian Industries. After the catastrophic presentation that ended Derek's credibility as a strategic executive, I returned to my office with a mixture of vindication and devastation. Elena's public support had validated my professional expertise, but watching my husband's career collapse in front of 70 industry stakeholders felt like witnessing the destruction of everything we'd built together over 8 years. But Elena's intervention had also revealed something troubling that went beyond Derek's individual judgment failure. During her confrontation with Marcus, she'd mentioned having independent knowledge about the Swiss company's criminal investigation that suggested she'd been conducting her own research into our potential acquisition targets. Natalie, can you come to my office? Elena's call came less than an hour after the disastrous presentation. We need to discuss some concerns I've been developing about our strategic decision-making processes.
Elena's corner office reflected her position as Meridian's chief financial officer, with wall-mounted monitors displaying real-time financial data, shelves lined with regulatory compliance manuals, and a conference table that could accommodate the kind of sensitive discussions that shaped corporate policy. But today, the office felt more like a forensic investigation command center. I've been reviewing the acquisition analysis that Marcus has been promoting, Elena said, spreading documents across her conference table. The Swiss pharmaceutical company was just the most obvious example of a pattern that's been concerning me for months.
The documents Elena showed me were comprehensive research reports that revealed systematic problems with every international acquisition target that Marcus had recommended. A German biotech company with fabricated patent portfolios, a French research firm with fraudulent clinical trial data, a Canadian pharmaceutical distributor with manipulated revenue recognition that disguised massive operating losses. Marcus has been recommending partnerships with companies that are either criminal enterprises or operational disasters disguised as strategic opportunities, Elena explained. His philosophy about prioritizing strategic vision over analytical verification has led him to ignore obvious red flags that any competent due diligence would have detected. But Elena's investigation had revealed something even more disturbing than Marcus's incompetent judgment. The pattern of failed acquisition targets wasn't random, it was systematic, suggesting either breathtaking incompetence or deliberate manipulation. "Natalie, I need your forensic expertise to help me understand something," Elena said, showing me financial documents that made my stomach clench with recognition. "I've been analyzing Marcus's own financial relationships with these acquisition targets, and I'm finding patterns that suggest potential conflicts of interest." The documents revealed that Marcus had financial relationships with consulting firms that represented several of the acquisition targets he'd been recommending. Shell companies registered to addresses near Marcus's previous consulting firm had received payments from the Swiss, German, and French companies that Marcus was promoting as strategic opportunities for Meridian. "This could be evidence of kickback schemes," I told Elena, applying my forensic training to analyze the financial flows between Marcus and the companies he was recommending. If Marcus is receiving compensation from acquisition targets in exchange for positive recommendations, that would constitute fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Elena nodded grimly. "That's what I suspected, but I needed your analytical expertise to confirm the patterns I was seeing. Marcus hasn't just been promoting bad strategic decisions, he's been taking money to recommend partnerships with companies he knew were unsuitable." The investigation that followed consumed the next 2 weeks of my professional life. Working with Elena, I traced financial flows between Marcus and the acquisition targets, documented the timing of payments relative to his recommendations, and analyzed the corporate structures that had been used to obscure these relationships. What we discovered was a sophisticated corruption scheme that had been operating for over 6 months. Marcus had been receiving consulting payments from companies that wanted to be acquired by pharmaceutical firms, then using his position at Meridian to promote these same companies as strategic opportunities. The companies he recommended were paying him to generate acquisition interest, regardless of their actual suitability as partners. The total amount Marcus has received from these consulting arrangements is over $200,000, I reported to Elena after completing the financial analysis. He's been systematically recommending companies that were paying him rather than companies that would benefit Meridian's strategic interests. But the corruption scheme had broader implications than Marcus's individual misconduct. His influence on Derek and other executives had created a corporate culture that dismissed analytical expertise and prioritized strategic narratives over verification. Multiple departments had been making decisions based on Marcus's recommendations without conducting proper due diligence. "Marcus's corruption has compromised decision-making throughout the company," observed. "Executives like Derek have been taught to dismiss analytical findings as limitations on strategic thinking, which means they've become vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation Marcus has been orchestrating." The investigation also revealed why Marcus had been so systematic about undermining my relationship with Derek. My forensic expertise represented the greatest threat to his corruption scheme because I had the analytical skills necessary to detect the financial relationships he was hiding. By teaching Derek to dismiss my work as operational limitation, Marcus was protecting himself from the scrutiny that would have exposed his criminal activity. "Marcus needed Derek to ignore your forensic analysis because your expertise would have detected the fraud immediately," Elena explained. "The campaign to isolate you from strategic decision-making wasn't just about corporate hierarchy, it was about preventing you from discovering evidence that could send Marcus to prison." The forensic evidence we'd gathered was comprehensive and damning. Marcus had violated federal laws regarding fiduciary duty, securities fraud, and conspiracy to defraud corporations. The companies he'd recommended were complicit in the scheme, paying him to generate acquisition interest from pharmaceutical companies they wanted to target. Elena and I prepared a complete report documenting Marcus's criminal activity and the systemic damage his influence had caused to Meridian's decision-making processes. The report would be presented to Meridian's board of directors and federal law enforcement agencies simultaneously. This investigation demonstrates why forensic expertise is essential for strategic decision-making, Elena told me as we finalized our findings. Marcus's corruption was only possible because executives like Derek were taught to dismiss analytical verification as limitation on strategic vision. But the investigation had also revealed the broader implications of Marcus's influence on corporate culture. Derek wasn't the only executive who had absorbed Marcus's philosophy about the superiority of strategic thinking over analytical expertise. Multiple managers throughout Meridian had been making decisions without proper verification, creating vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the specific companies Marcus had been recommending. We're going to need comprehensive retraining for executives who have been influenced by Marcus's approach, Elena explained. The entire leadership team needs to understand that analytical expertise enhances strategic decision-making rather than limiting it. The investigation that had started with Derek's catastrophic presentation had evolved into a comprehensive examination of corporate corruption and cultural dysfunction. Marcus's criminal activity had been enabled by a philosophy that dismissed analytical rigor as incompatible with strategic success. But as I prepared to present our findings to federal law enforcement, I realized that Derek's career destruction had been collateral damage in a much larger criminal conspiracy. The man who had dismissed my expertise as compliance limitation had been manipulated by someone whose interests were fundamentally opposed to Meridian's success. The question now was whether Derek's judgment had been corrupted by criminal influence, or whether his embrace of Marcus's philosophy had been so complete that he would continue to see analytical expertise as limitation rather than protection from the kind of manipulation that had destroyed his credibility and threatened his career. The federal investigation moved with the kind of systematic precision that I'd learned to appreciate during my previous work with law enforcement agencies. Within 48 hours of Elena and I presenting our forensic evidence to the FBI's white-collar crime unit, agents had secured warrants for Marcus's financial records, communications, and corporate accounts. Special Agent Patricia Hendricks, who led the federal task force investigating healthcare fraud, coordinated the operation with the kind of methodical approach that reminded me why I respected law enforcement's analytical rigor. Ms. Morrison, your forensic work has provided exactly the kind of evidence we need to prosecute complex corruption schemes, she told me during the initial briefing. The financial flows you documented between Marcus Webb and the acquisition targets establish clear patterns of criminal conspiracy and securities fraud. The raid on Marcus's office occurred on a Thursday morning while Meridian's executives were attending their weekly strategy meeting. Federal agents arrived with boxes for documents, digital forensics equipment for electronic records, and warrants that authorized seizure of any materials related to Marcus's consulting relationships with acquisition targets. I watched from my office as FBI agents escorted Marcus from the building in handcuffs, his confident executive presence replaced by the pale, shocked expression of someone whose criminal activity had been comprehensively documented by forensic investigation. The same strategic thinking that he'd promoted as superior to analytical expertise had been undone by exactly the kind of meticulous financial analysis he'd taught Derek to dismiss as operational limitation. The immediate consequences at Meridian Industries were swift and dramatic. Thompson Mitchell called an emergency meeting of all senior executives to address the criminal charges against Marcus and the systematic review of strategic decisions that his influence had affected. The conference room, where Derek had destroyed his credibility just weeks earlier, was now filled with executives trying to understand how extensively Marcus's corruption had compromised corporate decision-making. Marcus Webb has been arrested on federal charges of securities fraud, conspiracy to defraud corporations, and violation of fiduciary duty, Thompson announced to the assembled leadership team. The FBI investigation has revealed that he was receiving payments from companies he recommended as acquisition targets, using his position at Meridian to generate interest in partnerships that benefited his personal financial interests rather than our strategic goals. Derek sat in stunned silence as Thompson explained the scope of Marcus's criminal activity. The mentor who had taught him to dismiss analytical expertise as limitation on strategic vision had been systematically manipulating strategic decisions for personal profit. Every lesson Derek had absorbed about the superiority of executive thinking over operational analysis had been part of a criminal scheme designed to compromise his judgment. The federal investigation has also revealed that Marcus's influence on our decision-making processes created systematic vulnerabilities throughout the company, Thompson continued. Multiple departments were making strategic decisions without proper analytical verification because Marcus had promoted a corporate culture that dismissed rigorous analysis as limitation on executive thinking. Alina was asked to present the forensic findings that had exposed Marcus's corruption scheme. Her presentation was comprehensive and devastating, documenting how Marcus had received over $200,000 from companies he recommended as acquisition targets, while teaching Meridian executives to ignore the analytical expertise that would have detected these conflicts of interest. The criminal conspiracy was enabled by a philosophy that positioned analytical rigor as incompatible with strategic success, Elena explained to the executive team. Marcus taught managers throughout the company to dismiss forensic expertise and due diligence as operational limitations rather than essential components of strategic decision-making. Derek's face was pale as he realized how completely his professional judgment had been corrupted by criminal influence. The strategic philosophy that had seemed visionary and sophisticated was actually a manipulation technique designed to prevent analytical scrutiny of Marcus's fraudulent recommendations. But Elena's presentation also highlighted the broader implications of Marcus's influence on corporate culture. Multiple executives had absorbed his lessons about the hierarchy between strategic thinking and operational expertise, creating vulnerabilities that extended throughout Meridian's decision-making processes. We're going to implement mandatory retraining for all executives who participated in Marcus's strategic development programs, Thompson announced. The entire leadership team needs to understand that analytical expertise enhances strategic decision-making rather than limiting it. The federal charges against Marcus were extensive and carried potential sentences that could result in decades in prison. Securities fraud, conspiracy to defraud corporations, and violation of fiduciary duty were serious felonies that reflected the systematic nature of his criminal activity. The companies that had paid him for favorable recommendations were also being investigated as co-conspirators in the fraud scheme. Marcus Webb's arrest represents one of the largest corporate corruption cases we've prosecuted in the pharmaceutical industry, Agent Hendricks announced during a press conference that made national news. The forensic investigation that exposed this criminal conspiracy demonstrates the importance of analytical expertise in preventing corporate fraud and protecting shareholder interests. The media coverage of Marcus's arrest was extensive and damaging to his reputation in the corporate consulting industry. Articles in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and industry publications detailed how his strategic philosophy had been designed to facilitate criminal activity by discouraging analytical verification of his recommendations. But the most immediate consequence for Derek was the complete destruction of his credibility as a strategic executive. The presentation where he had dismissed forensic evidence of fraud as analytical limitation was now being cited as evidence of how Marcus's corruption scheme had compromised executive judgment throughout Meridian Industries. Derek Morrison's public dismissal of forensic evidence demonstrates how effectively Marcus Webb's criminal influence had corrupted decision-making processes, wrote Michael Chen, a pharmaceutical industry analyst, in his coverage of the federal investigation. Executives who absorbed Webb's philosophy about the superiority of strategic vision over analytical expertise became vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation that the forensic investigation exposed. Derek's position as regional sales director was now under review as part of the comprehensive evaluation of executives who had been influenced by Marcus's criminal philosophy. The man who had been considered a rising star in Meridian's leadership was now seen as someone whose judgment had been compromised by criminal manipulation. The irony was profound and devastating. Derek had dismissed my forensic expertise as compliance limitation that interfered with strategic thinking, but my analytical capabilities had exposed the criminal conspiracy that had been manipulating his judgment. The woman he'd characterized as someone who handled routine paperwork had provided the evidence that sent his mentor to federal prison. As federal agents continued their investigation of Marcus's criminal enterprise, I realized that Derek's humiliation had been collateral damage in a much larger conspiracy. The man who had publicly dismissed my expertise in front of 70 industry stakeholders had been systematically manipulated by criminal influence that was designed to compromise his analytical judgment. But the question remained whether Derek could acknowledge that his dismissal of forensic expertise had been part of a criminal scheme, or whether his embrace of Marcus's philosophy had been so complete that he would continue to see analytical rigor as limitation rather than protection from the manipulation that had destroyed his career and exposed him to professional humiliation that would follow him throughout the pharmaceutical industry. 3 months after Marcus's arrest, the professional vindication I received transformed not only my career, but my understanding of my own capabilities and value in ways I hadn't expected. Elena Vasquez had been working behind the scenes to ensure that my role in exposing the corruption scheme received appropriate recognition, both within Meridian Industries and throughout the broader pharmaceutical industry. Natalie, I want to offer you a position that reflects the actual value of your expertise to this company, Elena announced during a meeting in Thompson Mitchell's office. We're creating a new role, Vice President of Financial Integrity and Risk Assessment. You'll be responsible for all forensic investigations, acquisition due diligence, and strategic decision analysis that involves financial verification. The promotion was unprecedented at Meridian Industries. No forensic accountant had ever been elevated to vice president level, and the position Elena was offering would make me one of the highest-ranking executives in the company. More importantly, it represented institutional recognition that analytical expertise was essential for strategic decision-making rather than operational support for executive thinking. Your forensic work saved this company from potentially catastrophic financial losses and criminal liability, Thompson explained. The Marcus Webb investigation demonstrated that analytical rigor isn't a limitation on strategic thinking, it's the foundation that makes strategic thinking possible. The salary increase was substantial, nearly doubling my previous compensation and positioning me among the highest-paid executives at Meridian. But the professional recognition extended far beyond financial compensation. Elena had arranged for me to present the Marcus Webb case study at the National Pharmaceutical Industry Conference, where my analysis would influence fraud prevention protocols across the entire healthcare sector. Your investigative techniques are being adopted as standard practice by pharmaceutical companies nationwide, Elena told me. The forensic methods you developed to detect corruption schemes are protecting the entire industry from the kind of criminal manipulation that Marcus was orchestrating. The federal prosecution of Marcus Webb culminated in a plea agreement that resulted in a 7-year prison sentence and permanent prohibition from working in corporate consulting or pharmaceutical industry roles. The companies that had paid him for favorable recommendations were fined collectively over $15 million and required to implement comprehensive compliance monitoring systems. Marcus Webb's prosecution represents a landmark case in corporate fraud prevention, Agent Hendricks explained during the sentencing hearing. The forensic investigation that exposed his criminal activity has established new standards for detecting and preventing corruption in corporate strategic decision-making. But the most significant vindication came from the broader pharmaceutical industry's recognition of my expertise. The Association of Corporate Fraud Investigators awarded me their highest honor for contributions to healthcare fraud prevention, and 3 major pharmaceutical companies offered me senior executive positions with salaries that exceeded what I was earning at Meridian. Natalie Morrison's work has redefined how our industry approaches strategic decision-making and risk assessment, wrote Dr. Patricia Williams, editor of the Journal of Pharmaceutical Business Intelligence. Her forensic techniques are protecting companies from criminal manipulation while ensuring that legitimate strategic opportunities aren't compromised by inadequate due diligence. Derek's reaction to my professional success was complex and painful to witness. The federal investigation had revealed that his judgment had been systematically corrupted by criminal influence, which provided some explanation for his dismissive treatment of my expertise. But acknowledging that he'd been manipulated also required accepting that his understanding of strategic thinking had been fundamentally flawed. I didn't realize how completely Marcus had influenced my thinking about analytical work, Derek admitted during one of our few conversations after the investigation concluded. He convinced me that forensic analysis was a limitation on strategic vision, but your investigation proved that analytical expertise is what protects strategic thinking from criminal manipulation. The acknowledgement was appropriate but felt hollow after months of public humiliation and professional dismissal. Derek's recognition of my expertise came only after federal law enforcement had validated my capabilities and media coverage had established my reputation as a leading expert in corporate fraud prevention. Derek's own career had been permanently damaged by his association with Marcus and his public dismissal of forensic evidence during the quarterly presentation. While Meridian didn't terminate his employment, his position was downgraded to senior sales representative with no management responsibilities or prospects for executive advancement. Derek Morrison's judgment was compromised by criminal influence, Elena explained during the company's restructuring discussions, but his public dismissal of analytical expertise demonstrates fundamental gaps in understanding that make him unsuitable for strategic leadership roles. The pharmaceutical industry's response to Derek's involvement with Marcus was harsh and unforgiving. The presentation where he'd recommended a criminal enterprise as a strategic opportunity was cited in industry publications as an example of how corruption schemes compromise executive judgment. His reputation as a strategic thinker was permanently destroyed. But perhaps most significantly, my success had broader implications for how the pharmaceutical industry approached the relationship between analytical expertise and strategic decision-making. Companies across the healthcare sector were implementing new protocols that required forensic verification for all acquisition targets and strategic partnerships. The Marcus Webb case has demonstrated that analytical rigor enhances strategic success rather than limiting it, explained Dr. Michael Rodriguez during a Harvard Business School case study presentation. Companies that integrate forensic expertise into strategic decision-making are protecting themselves from criminal manipulation while identifying legitimate opportunities that their competitors might miss. Elena had also arranged for me to join the boards of directors for 3 pharmaceutical industry associations, positions that would influence fraud prevention policy and strategic decision-making standards across the entire healthcare sector. My expertise was now being recognized at the highest levels of industry leadership. Your forensic work has established new standards for corporate governance in pharmaceutical companies, Elena told me during my first board meeting. The techniques you developed are being adopted internationally as best practices for preventing the kind of corruption that Marcus Webb was orchestrating. The vindication was comprehensive and professionally transformative. The woman Derek had characterized as someone who handled routine paperwork was now recognized as one of the leading experts in pharmaceutical industry fraud prevention. My analytical capabilities were influencing policy at the national level and protecting companies across the healthcare sector from criminal manipulation. But the personal cost had been significant. Derek's dismissal of my expertise and his public characterization of my work as compliance limitation had revealed fundamental problems in our marriage that extended beyond Marcus's criminal influence. Even acknowledging that his judgment had been corrupted didn't repair the damage that months of professional dismissal and personal humiliation had caused to our relationship. As I prepared to assume my new role as Vice President of Financial Integrity and Risk Assessment, I realized that my professional vindication had come at the cost of my marriage to someone who had lost sight of my value and capabilities. The woman whose expertise was now being recognized nationally would have to decide whether her personal relationships could evolve to match her professional success.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.